Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily update for today, February 16th, 2022. I'm assuming if you're watching this video update, you're not buried in some bomb shelter, hunkered down in anticipation of a war based on an invasion of Ukraine by Russia, which the intelligence community predicted would begin on today, Wednesday, the 16th of February. Well, we were told that the war would start. So far, as of noon Central Europe time, there's no war. Now, there are new developments which confirm, yes, you have been lied to. And I'm going to go through some of these in the anticipation that having the facts will give you the courage to go out and fight to take power away from the corrupt networks that are controlling the intelligence community, the government of the United States and the governments of the NATO countries and the United Kingdom, as well as the media, who have been promoting these lying narratives day after day after day to increase the hysteria in the population and cause people to literally duck from reality. Now let's start with a very interesting article that was written by Jack Matlock, who was Ronald Reagan's ambassador to Russia, and who was involved directly in the negotiations at the end of the Cold War about the relationship of NATO and Russia. Matlock has a very sharp attack on the false axioms or the lies that have been produced by the administrations and by the media in implicating Russia as the cause of the tension over Ukraine right now. Matlock says that he doesn't believe that there was ever a Russian intention to invade Ukraine. He said the confrontation between Kiev and the region in eastern Ukraine is the idea that it's Russia's fault is also wrong. And then he adds that the lie that Putin intends to reconstitute the Soviet Empire is another concoction as part of an anti-Russian hysteria dominating U.S. policy. He cites Putin's speech in Munich in 2007, which he paraphrases to say, quote, "Treat us with at least a modicum of respect. We do not threaten you or your allies. Why do you refuse us the security you insist for yourself?" And this has been at the center of Russia's relationships with the West, the demand for that respect, the demand for recognizing that Russia does have security interests, and Putin's call for security guarantees, which is at the heart of this situation, not Ukraine itself. Now, Matlock says he shares Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov's view that a Biden administration, facing a growing crescendo of crises, is looking for a victory. In other words, the Biden administration can say, we caught Russia planning an invasion, we exposed it, we got a full unity from our allies and an agreement to join us to threaten to impose crippling sanctions, and therefore Russia backed down. We win. Yay, yay, yay. Now, Matlock called this whole event an extremely dangerous charade. And he writes in this article, which is going to be linked at the bottom of the description of this video, he writes that in 1997, when the issue of NATO expansion was planned, he testified before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee as the former ambassador to Russia. And he described this plan as, quote, misguided, unquote, and added, quote, if it should be approved by the U.S. Senate, it may well go down in history as the most profound strategic blunder made since the end of the Cold War, unquote. In other words, expanding NATO eastward breaks promises made, and he takes that up. He exposed one more lie, that Russia was not given any promises about eastward expansion. He said that, in fact, the promise was made to Russia that NATO would not move eastward, that it would expand, quote, not 1 inch, unquote, which is what Secretary of State Baker said at the time of the negotiations. So I'd urge people to read this full article. Here's someone who was there, who was a long-term State Department official, worked with the Ronald Reagan and then the Bush administration and made sure that there were agreements to remove the danger of a nuclear confrontation during the dismantling of the Soviet Union. And Matlock's view on this has now been confirmed by another participant, the former French Foreign Minister Dumas, who was present at some of these post-1989 talks. Dumas just gave an interview in Les Crazies, where he said that he, Secretary of State Baker, German Foreign Minister Hans-Dietrich Genscher, and others promised Russia there would be no expansion of NATO eastward, especially into the former Warsaw Pact countries. The fact that Dumas confirms this is further indication that those who say there was no promise made, Russia is lying or misinterpreting what was done, are engaged in a historic fraud to justify the continuing buildup of NATO for the military-industrial complex and on behalf of the strategic and financial interests of the Anglo-American Empire. And it has nothing to do with the security of the West, nothing whatsoever. And others are starting to speak out. Former Congressman Tulsi Gabbard, for example, former U.S. Senator Sam Nunn, and a group of others who are part of a committee on nuclear arms have come out very strongly, warning of the danger of nuclear war if the U.S. does not take the Russian requests for negotiations seriously. Even Michael McFaul, who was Obama's anti-Russian ambassador, said we need a Helsinki II, that is a new framework under the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. That's a new framework for European security. But we need more voices, both those in official positions, but also from the general public, demanding that this war drive not only be stopped, but that the U.S. change its posture from being the biggest kid on the block, the number one, the unipolar world power, and instead take into consideration the security concerns of other nations. Now, it's reported that Russian troops are gradually returning to their barracks, although it's said that Biden and NATO leaders don't believe this. But that's happening not because of the blusters of Blinken and Bojo and NATO's Stoltenberg, but because the military exercises of Russia are coming to an end, which is what they said at the very beginning. There was no intention for an invasion. Putin and Lavrov have said that repeatedly. Russian defense officials have said that. And yet the U.S. intelligence committees, through spokesmen such as Blinken and others, continue to say that an invasion could happen any day. Now, the important point is that the West, that is especially the US, the UK, and NATO, have not acknowledged yet the legitimacy of the security demands raised by President Putin of Russia. And Putin and Lavrov, in raising this issue, have pointed to multiple agreements that have been signed by Russia and the West since 1991, which state that no country can enhance its security at the expense of another. All of these have been broken by the West in its eastward expansion of NATO. Now, in an act of real hysteria, the United States has moved its embassy personnel out of Kiev further west. The Ukrainian Defense Minister, Reznikov, who has on several occasions asked the U.S., along with President Zelensky, to stop the war hysteria, Reznikov said, quote, "Not a single offensive strike group has been created," unquote, by Russia. So why continue to push the pro-war narrative? Well, many suspect it is designed to make Biden look good. Most recent wars have been preceded by a series of these kinds of lies from the intelligence community, repeated by political officials and leaders and in the media. There was George H.W. Bush's lies that justified the invasion of Panama and the Operation Desert Storm against Iraq. There were lies from the Clinton administration that led to the NATO-US bombing of Serbia. There were the Bush and Obama post-9/11 lies that led to the endless wars starting with Afghanistan, Iraq, continuing with the war in Libya, the arming of terrorists in Syria to overthrow the Assad government. Trump himself was victim of these lies from the intelligence community when he launched a bombing of Syria and the drone killing of the head of Iran's Revolutionary Guard, based on reports that there were supposedly chemical weapons used by Syria, which have been thoroughly debunked, and on the Iran Revolutionary Guards that there were planned attempts at terrorist attacks against American positions, when in fact the Iranian forces in Iraq were working together with the United States to crush ISIS and Al-Qaeda. These kinds of lies continue, and they have to be called out, and they have to be stopped. Now, diplomacy is continuing. German Chancellor Scholz was in Moscow yesterday to meet with Putin. He described the meetings with Putin as, quote, very intensive, very trusting conversation, unquote. That's what's needed now, to move into a new paradigm, which is not based on having US military and NATO military enforce the arbitrary doctrine of a rules-based order, but instead to stand on the hundreds of years of advances made on the basis of the Peace of Westphalia. No internal interference in other nations' affairs. Recognize that there are security interests of other nations and work together with them. That's the basis of a secure and stable world order, not the diktats coming from the City of London that countries must give up their sovereignty and accept being subservient to the unipolar power of the United States and its secondary allies. These are demands coming from London, demands coming from US intelligence, demands coming from the broader basis of the military-industrial complex. These are demands which threaten your security. So assuming that we're safe for the moment from a nuclear war, and that doesn't mean we're out of the woods. The fact that the Russians may be moving back doesn't mean that there won't be a provocation from the crazies in Kiev, which will end up with an invasion of Ukraine. But we must make sure that this cabal of liars does not have the support of the American people for this kind of policy. So check out the Matlock article, and I'll see you again tomorrow.